Hey everyone, this is FIDE Master Kostya Kavitsky here back again at Chess.com to start a new series on improving your strategy or your positional understanding. I firmly believe that the best way to improve your strategy is to accumulate a lot of positional ideas through the study of various master level games. I think that if every time you study a game you can take away 2 to 3 interesting ideas or maneuvers that stuck out to you, then over time you can start accumulating these ideas and learn to use them in your own games. And hopefully this series will sort of give you an introduction as to how that can actually really affect your level of play and your positional understanding. And in this video today, I'll show you guys a couple of examples that made an influence on my positional understanding and, as we'll see, actually affected my own level of play. I was able to use some of the ideas I learned from my previous studies and actually incorporated them into my own games. So this first example here comes from the 2012 World Championship match between Boris Gelfand and Vishy Anand, and this was one of the rapid games in the tiebreak portion of the match. And here Gelfand played c5, Black responded bishop b8, and f4. And in a few more moves, it was clear that White had a pretty clear advantage based on having a lot more space. And the reason that this game actually stuck in my memory was because at first I was kind of surprised that White, despite having the 2 bishops, opted to close the position in such a radical way. He first played c5 and then played f4, making sure that the center was not going to open up anytime soon. Later, of course, I understood that the point of all this was to restrict Black's play. White firmly controls the e5 square now, and after an eventual b4, b5, White was definitely getting the better game. Now I want to show you guys another game that definitely made an influence on my positional understanding. This is a game between Alexander Grischuk and Levon Aronian in their candidates match, also from 2012. And here we've got a very typical Queen's Gambit declined with White playing the bishop f4 line, and Grischuk decided to seize space early on with this move c5. And I'll quickly take you guys through the early middle game because there's a couple of ideas that were interesting here. Aronian played b6, which is a very common move to play when White has advanced space. As you've probably heard before, when your opponent sees a space, you want to challenge the space with a pawn break as quickly as possible. Grischuk played b4, trying to hold on to a c5 pawn and wanting to recapture with the b pawn in case of b takes c5. Aronian played a5, continuing to attack White's structure, and Grischuk played a3. And it's important to recognize that this move a3 and b4 was only possible because White's rook on a1 is protected. Otherwise, Black would have a takes b4, and White wouldn't be able to recapture if the rook on a1 was unprotected. So here White's able to keep his space advantage, which is very important, but Aronian now played the move bishop a6, which is another very important idea, not just for the opening, but also for your own positional understanding. If you play the French defense, you're probably well aware that the bishop on c8 can often become stuck as a very passive piece, and if Black gets the opportunity, he should usually try to exchange it with the move like bishop a6, sort of getting rid of his worst minor piece. So now the game continued pretty normally. Bishop takes a6, rook takes a6, castles, queen a8, rook b1, Black traded on b4 to open up the a file, queen b7, queen c2, rook a8. And now Grischuk played a pretty common knight maneuver in this structure. He played knight e1, bishop d8, and knight d3, bringing the knight to a slightly more useful square on d3. And now Aronian made a mistake and played the natural-looking move rook a3. And here Grischuk played the move b5, which is a very strong pawn break. And I remember analyzing this game with someone, and they were surprised that Black allowed this move b5 because, as he explained to me, usually in the structure, when White is able to get the move b4, b5 in and it works out tactically, it's usually very, very good for White. And that definitely stuck in my memory, as we'll see in a game I'm going to show you later on. And indeed, this move is very strong. The point is that if black plays c takes b5, then after knight takes b5, white has a double threat. He wants to play c5, c6, winning a piece, and of course he wants to play knight takes a3, winning material that way. So since black cannot take on b5, Aronian played b takes c5, d takes c5, and bishop e7. Since again, if c takes b5, knight takes b5, white has this double threat of knight takes a3 and c5, c6, which is pretty much winning on the spot. So without being able to take on b5, Aronian played bishop e7, and after rook fc1, it was clear that white had a pretty large advantage with such a powerful pawn storm on the queen side, and Grischuk went on to win this game quite comfortably. So now I want to show you guys a game I played just a few months ago as part of an online training match. This is my game against Patrick Chi, who I didn't know before this game, but is a master and quite a decent player. And I was playing white. I played d4, and we got a Slav defense that is pretty theoretical nowadays. I play this move knight h4 with the idea of taking black's bishop. Bishop g6, takes, bishop d3, bishop d6, h3, knight d7, castles, and queen e7. And as you might have noticed, this opening is actually very similar to the one that Gelfand played in his game with Anand. And while I was trying to figure out what to do in this position, I recalled that game, and I remembered this idea of playing c4, c5, and f2, f4 to gain a lot of space and restrict black's counterplay. And this especially seemed quite promising to me for this game because black had just played queen e7 with the probable idea of playing d takes c4 and e6, e5, gaining some space and counterplaying the center, which I, of course, did not want to allow. So I played c5, bishop c7, and f4. And here my opponent played the very natural move b6. As we've already seen from the Grischuk-Aronian game, when white has this advanced c4, c5, whether it's from the Queen's Gambit declined or the Slav or any other opening, black often wants to challenge this pawn with b7, b6, sort of fighting back on the queen side. Here after b4, a5, white cannot play a3 because the rook on a1 is hanging. So after a2, a3, a takes b4, white would simply be losing material. So before we got to this position, of course, I realized that I wouldn't be able to play a3. While I was thinking about black's b6 move, I realized that after b4 and a5, I would have an idea to play b5, like in the Grischuk-Aronian game, and I would figure that I should definitely look at this pawn break, because if it works, then I knew that probably white would be pretty successful in the ensuing middle game. And indeed, although the ideas aren't exactly the same, it turns out this pawn break is quite strong for white. And the main point is that after c takes b5, I want to play the in-between move c6, attacking black's knight. And after knight b8, for example, white can take on b5 with the bishop, but it's actually stronger to take with the knight, with the idea that black can't really take this pawn because after bishop a3, queen d7, taking on c7, queen takes c7, and bishop b5, it soon becomes pretty clear that black is actually in a lot of trouble and is probably completely lost. Of course, this pin against the king is very strong. White is ready to play rook c1 and queen c2 and simply win this knight. And this bishop is also extremely useful in that black cannot castle. So basically this rook is out of the game and can't really contribute to black's defense. So basically white is more likely than not going to win this knight on c6 in the very near future. So since c takes b5 didn't work, I started analyzing b takes c5, which was pretty much black's only other option and what was actually played in the game. I played b takes c6, knight b8, and bishop a3. And before I initiated this pawn break with b4, b5, I had to try and evaluate this position and see whether or not white would be getting some kind of initiative, which was my initial intuition, but of course I wanted to back this up with some kind of concrete calculation. And of course I figured that even if black is able to take this pawn, then white is going to have a lot of very strong pressure on the queen side, and that is exactly what took place in this game. My opponent rightfully castled, correctly noticing that, he really needed to get his king out of the center as soon as possible. And here I played queen a4. It was actually stronger to play bishop takes c5, with the idea that after bishop d6, at first it looks like after the trade of bishops, black is simply going to pick up the pawn and be very close to equalizing, but white has this trick, which I didn't notice in the game, to play c7. The idea being that the bishop cannot take because it's pinned to the queen, and if queen takes, white plays knight b5, winning a piece. And after knight c6, white can simply trade bishops and play knight b5. And with this knight firmly protected and the knight firmly protecting the pawn, it looks like white is just going to stay a clear pawn ahead. And of course, this pawn on c7 is very strong, so white would be doing quite well here. The rooks, of course, are ready to come to the files, and after queen a4, white is going to have a pretty much winning position. So after not seeing this trick, I instead played a more natural move, queen a4, hoping to keep the pressure on black's position and try to hold on to this pawn for as long as I could. Black played rook c8, knight b5, bishop b6, and at this point I realized that I'm not going to be able to hold on to this pawn any longer, but I had some more ideas here of putting pressure on black's position. I played rook fc1, rook takes c6, dc5, bishop c5, and knight d4. And here black is actually under quite a bit of pressure due to the pin here and the pin along the c file. And black should have probably played bishop takes a3 here, where after I take on c6, knight takes c6, and rook takes c6 or queen takes c6, white is up the exchange, but still has a bit of work to do before he can win this game, as black has a pawn and some compensation in the form of having this nice dark scored bishop, which can come to c5 and put pressure on e3. White is still better, but it's not immediately winning. Instead, black played rook c8, and here I was able to execute an idea which I've sort of seen from a few moves before, and I played the move rook takes c5. And of course, this is a tactical idea that I have definitely seen before in many puzzles. When you have this kind of pin along a diagonal, instead of giving up your bishop on c5, you give up one of your attacking pieces, momentarily sacrificing material, whereas after rook takes c5 and knight b3, the idea is just to win the rook outright and come out ahead in material. And in this case, this is definitely what's going to happen, as black doesn't have a way to defend the rook, and the game ended pretty quickly. After knight d7, I played queen d4, knight c6, and bishop takes c5, with the point being that after black takes my queen, I take on e7, and the knight doesn't have anything to do on d4 since the knight on b3 is protected. So knight b3, a b3, and white is coming out ahead a piece. Instead, after bishop takes c5, black played knight takes c5, but of course this endgame here, with an extra piece versus just one pawn, I had no problems winning, and the game didn't really last much longer. So the point of showing you this game was to demonstrate how the accumulation of different positional ideas in your studies can often be used in your own games. And it started on move 11 here, when I played c5, bishop c7, and f4 to gain lots of space, the same way that Gelfand did versus Anand. And then after b6, b4, and a5, I was able to find this really nice pawn break b5. And would I have been able to find this move on my own if I wasn't familiar with the Grishchuk-Aronian game? It's certainly possible, but what made this kind of easy for me during the game was having this memory of this positional idea somewhat in the back of my mind that I was able to access. And this is kind of the whole thesis to my beliefs on positional understanding, is that once you acquire lots of knowledge and experience and have played through many, many master level games, or you're actually trying to take some positional ideas away, then over time your own positional understanding builds up and you're often playing ideas in your games that you've seen before. Of course, all these ideas have to be justified with your calculation, but acquiring these ideas is really the first step to becoming a well-rounded strategic player. So next time we'll be discussing more ways of improving your strategy. And until then, I hope to see all of you around here on chess.com.